Welcome to Mysteries of MARC. This is actually one of my favorite workshops to teach, and I don't just say that about everything. Just a couple of things to let you know that today we're going to have the workshop and discussion, so please, pop questions in the chat box, or if you have feedback as we go along, please participate. After the workshop, you will also have examples to work through, some exercises to work through on that handout sheet that went out, that resources sheet in that folder. And actually this folder has everything in it, including the slides. So if you just want one stop to go to, you can do that. But in that resources guide, there's actually a self-scoring little knowledge check or quiz or exercises, whatever you want to call it. I don't see your grades. I don't know who takes the little thing that I put together, so feel free to go through it and see how you do. If you miss something, it'll give you a little bit of feedback and tell you what the right answer is. So have fun with that. There's also some exercises you can go through that are from real life exercises. On that note, if you want to tell me a little bit about yourself, or your experience with MARC, or any specific questions you'd like me to address, go ahead and go for it. There's me. I was going for, I was trying to look knowledgeable and professional, and instead I think I just look a little grumpy. So I was sorry about that. Maybe I should have smiled when I took my photo, but anyway, I liked being out in the library, and I was trying to get a photo that represented both the computer side and the book side, but I'm not sure how well I did, but there I am. Vicki gave a really nice introduction to me, so I'm not going to talk more about myself, but you can find me on LinkedIn, other places. Feel free to network with me if you find me. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to cover the basic structure of an OCLC MARC bibliographic record. We're going to talk a little bit about OCLC's MARC documentation, just a tiny bit. We're not going to go through most of that because it's really in the resources. We are mostly going to focus really on the most common fields used in records, and we're going to talk about the difference in the structure of the MARC record itself. So we're going to get a little bit technical today. I will try to keep it sort of grounded in the practical as we go along. And really what I want you to, kind of take away from today's session is that if you're really interested in how MARC works and you really want to know how these pieces work together in a record, you're going to need to be a member of the Look It Up Club, as my librarian when I was a kid would tell us. We need to be a member of the Look It Up Club. So I think librarians and library folks are good at doing that. So this is definitely one of those areas where you're going to be a member of the Look It Up Club. I will say, having cataloged for years and years and done a lot of crosswalking records back and forth between different institutions and digital repositories, all that kind of stuff, that I have learned some of these. I've actually committed them to memory. Some of those of you who have been cataloging for years can probably you've committed some of these to memory as well. However, there's still things out there that are new, and we're going to talk a little bit about the new fields today, but we're also really going to focus on that sort of practical knowledge too. But the important thing is knowing your resources so you can look things up. And that's true if you're copy cataloging, that's true if you're trying to move records back and forth between one system, if you are migrating records or preparing your ILS for migration, being able to go in and understand what the resources are so that you can make sure your records are prepared for migration is the important part. So why do we do this? Why do we care about this MARC thing? Well, for one thing, most of our systems are still using the MARC record format. MARC stands for Machine Readable Cataloging, and this has been around since the 1960s, people. I mean, it's just incredible. We should really give ourselves a pat on the back and thank our colleagues that came before us, because this has been around for a long time. And, as cataloging rules have changed, the information that was recorded was changed, and how that information was recorded. So we can kind of think of that as like the text or the content of the record. So, the content of the record changed. What we would write down in a record changed, but it still went into this MARC format. 1968, Library Congress and some other people started working on how we were going to move our data from that card you know, this card thing, to an electronic format. Now, I would like for you to take a moment and think about 1968. Some of you were around in 1968. Some of us weren't around in 1968, but think about what you know of 1968, besides all of the political stuff and everything that was going on that feels kind of like today. But thinking about what you know about that world. You know, the web didn't exist. Google didn't exist. Certainly Facebook and social media did not exist. Computers as we know them did not exist. Certainly not cell phones or laptops. You know, none of that kind of stuff existed. So we were really, as a community, really on the forefront of information, the information and knowledge profession. So, you know, we really do need to recognize that piece of it, because I think when we start looking at like where we are now, we sometimes feel like we're sort of left behind, but we were at the forefront of the information revolution. So MARC is a mixture of, controlled access points, and we're not going to talk a whole lot about controlled access points and what that means, but basically that means you're looking at a controlled vocabulary or an authoritative resource. So it doesn't mean that you can just write anything into those fields you want. You have to choose from a particular source, and we'll talk more about that as we're looking at those records. And then free text. You know, free text is where I would say you can write anything you want, but we do have guidelines for what we record there. And this provides flexibility and structure, and we're going to talk more about flexibility and structure because that's really a challenge for us with MARC records these days. And the more sort of free text that you have, the less precision you have in terms of being able to find things. Now, when we look at Google as a whole, what do we do when we search something in a discovery layer or in Google? You just type something in, right? You don't format it in any particular way. Unless you go to advanced searching, you're not choosing a field to search, you're just typing something in. That is the essence of free text. You're just typing something in, and Google or the discovery layer is going to look at what you've typed, and then it's going to compare it to the records that it has access to, and it's going to try to find those items. Now with Google, it gets a little more complicated because there's paid results that show up higher. So, you know, there's a lot of different things that go into it besides whether or not your phrase or keywords, how often they appear. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, because it is an important part of like how our stuff works. To make it a little bit more complicated, under RDA, which is Resource Description and Access, that is our revised rules for how we catalog. One of those guidelines was that we would now have some fields that are transcription. Transcription means that you record it or key it or type it as it appears on your item or resource. And we're going to talk more about those fields as we go along. I actually have a list you can look at for those. And then of course we have other fields where we can kind of type what we want. And then we have another thing that is actually starting to be discussed in terms of whether or not we still need it, and this is called ISBD punctuation, and we're going to talk a little bit about that too, because this impacts what goes into a MARC record in terms of how it's formatted, and it also impacts if you're working with like an ILS or a discovery layer. So we'll talk more about that as we go along. Of course, we have standards that we apply on top of that. So MARC is just really a list of fields with specific defined subfields and formatting. Everything else that we apply on top of that comes from our cataloging rules. So this allows the computers to manipulate the data, and that's where we get our search, that's where we get our indexing, and that's where we get our display. And we're going to talk about the difference between index and display, because if you are either trying to get something to show up in your ILS and it's not, or maybe you have a brief record and a full record and you want some specific information to show up in your full record and it's not, or maybe you want something, maybe there's something showing up when your patrons are searching and you're like, yeah, they don't really need to see that, or it's confusing. We're going to talk about the difference of that and what you can do to change that. The other thing that MARC does is it allows our records to be shared. You know, we have OCLC, some of us use SkyRiver. Maybe you're sharing records in your consortia. Maybe you're sharing records, you're getting records between vendors or from vendors. So, you know, MARC really allows us to share those records. It was a common standard that allowed us to share records across various platforms. And so this was a big deal in the night. So remember, 1968, this is when we started doing this. This was a very big deal. It allowed us to start sharing our records electronically between libraries. So, you know, this was a huge deal for us. It also allowed us to automate printing of card catalogs. So when I first started, my library had stopped printing card catalogs. Some libraries printed card catalogs up until the 1990s. There are some libraries that still create their own card catalogs. OCLC stopped printing, I think it's 1996, somewhere around there. My library, many years later, still had a backlog of things to file because, of course, if you're in a large academic library, you have thousands of records that are being created maybe every month, you know, maybe even 100,000 records being created every month when you put the combined effort into everybody. That's a lot of cards to file. Thankfully, I did not, only had to file cards a couple of times. But those of you who've been cataloging for a while, you probably remember filing cards well. So most of our current catalog systems still use MARC. Even if they're not using MARC to actually serve up or to display the information to the public, they're still using MARC on the back end in some ways because we as catalogers are still working with MARC records. So even if our ILS system is doing something else that we're not seeing, we are still working in that MARC record typically. Now, if you are working in a digital library, if you're working in an institutional repository, if you're working in some other kind of database, and you're working with records, you may be working with a different metadata schema, and you may create a MARC record in between there, or the system may create a MARC record in between there, because MARC is really where we are focused with our ILSs. Unfortunately, and I think this is the sad part of MARC, we can all have a little cry on this one, we never fully utilize the fields and functionalities of MARC, and it is at the end of its lifespan. So why is it at the end of its lifespan? I mean, I know some of you know, there's no spoiler here. You know, the world has changed. So think about 1968, who was creating electronic data? What did computers look like? Well, we were creating electronic data, at least at the Library of Congress and some of the, you know, innovators of electronic data for libraries. So, you know, there were people out there creating it. A lot of libraries were still doing card catalogs, but, you know, there was this effort to move us to the electronic age. At some point, your library, if it's an older library, did migrate from a card catalog to the electronic records. If your library is newer, you may have just come in and been electronic only. So it kind of depends upon how old your library may have been in terms of what you had to do. But we just never really were able to fully utilize all the fields and functionalities in MARC. And we'll talk a little bit about those as we go along. But the world has changed. And, you know, think about what you have right in front of you. You know, you have a computer or a desktop, maybe you have a laptop, maybe you have 2 screens. Some of you have 3 or 4 screens probably. I've seen your offices. And you have your phone, right? So you have your phone or a tablet, or maybe you're listening to this or watching this on your phone or your tablet. We have multiple platforms and multiple devices that we can access content on. And, you know, maybe you are, you know, maybe you saw some of the emails that went out about this program. That program created data about that announcement. Your email creates data. Every time you send an email, it creates some data. If you take a photo on your camera, that creates data. All the things you do on your cell phone. I mean, we talk about privacy and personal data. Well, that's data, right? It's all data. when you post something on Facebook, when your library does a blog post, when you tweet something, if you're Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok or whatever it is out there you're doing, we're all content creators today. And all of our content that we are creating is data. Now, once we take off our social media, doing all this fun stuff that we like to do, once we take off that hat and we look at that through the lens of cataloging, we as catalogers, we have all that data out there we're creating, but we are also managing or working with data. It's just we're working with data typically just for resources that our library acquires. So that may be an ebook, it may be a streamed video that you've purchased access to, it may be a database that you have purchased access to, maybe things that you share in your consortia, it may be a print book that comes out, it's the latest bestseller that comes out, it's an audiobook that everybody wants to listen to. Maybe you are archiving websites, or maybe you are digitizing letters from a community history project and you are putting those into your repository. So we are all part of that larger information network that's out there. And so that's really where we're kind of bumping up to right now. We had to sort of revise our cataloging rules so that they would be more inclusive of digital content, and that they would they would allow us to describe digital content in a way that was more useful and accurate for digital content. I mean, that was a big part of RDA, resource description access. But the other piece of it then is like, what do we do with this MARC format that we've put all this information into? That is not real, it's not like anything else out there on the web. So all these other things that I've talked about, they all have data surrounding them. A lot of them have metadata structures and schemas and rules in terms of how they're described. And our data does not fit into that world. We have to do a lot of work to get it to be out there. And if you've ever tried to Google and find a MARC record and just see a MARC record, you know how hard that is to do, because our MARC records are not really, we have gotten left behind in that way. So one of the things that a lot of ILS developers are looking at, and if you're in the open source community, Evergreen and Koha are also looking at this, is what is our next generation? What is our next gen systems going to look at? And we've been talking next gen systems for at least 10 years, I think, and there has been a lot of different evolutions. But what is going to be that next thing? And that's when we'll get to BibFrame. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the end, but I just kind of want to set the stage for where we are now and kind of where we're going as we look forward. On a more practical note, MARC records can be bibliographic. That means descriptive information or metadata. Metadata is, the whole thing, data about data. Well, it is data about data, but for our purposes, we deal with descriptive information, what the item is about, so that bibliographic part of it, or MARC can be a holdings record. And this is information about the nature of that item. So that's ownership, holdings, this could be including copies. Some ILSs have MARC formatted holdings, or location records, holdings records, whatever you may call them. Some systems don't. Most systems, most ILS systems, at least the ILS part of it, has a bibliographic record in a MARC format right now. So we're going to mostly focus on the bibliographic part of it because that's the piece that most of us share in common. Also, if you're doing MARC formatted holdings records, they're a little bit more, I would say a little simpler, unless you're doing serials. They're a little simpler, and they're also very library specific. So the decisions you make in terms of which fields you're going to use, which subfields you're going to use in the MARC formatted holdings record is very specific to your community, your system, or the format of resources that you're handling. So we're going to focus on the bibliographic part of it because that's the piece that we all share in common. So a bibliographic record, and we're going to see a lot of different screenshots. I just kind of wanted right now show you like the backside, and it's kind of Cody looking, And then you have the front side, which looks a little prettier and makes a little more sense. So we're going to go through fields in more detail in just a minute. We're just kind of thinking about the back side that we see, and we see the front side if we go look at it in the public view, or what our patrons are looking at. This is the difference between a holdings. Remember I said there's a MARC formatted holdings record. So if you just taken a little bit more of a look at the bibliographic record, this is not even the whole bibliographic record. This stops at the 580 field for a serial, but it does make a nice pretty description. So you see that it's connected to the description there. But then if you go over and look at the holdings record, you can see it's a much shorter record, and you can see information here, and I know it's very Cody oriented, but you can see information here like the call number. You can see some information in terms of the location where this lives, and then also information, since this is serial, about specific volumes that library holds. So information about specific volumes or items that a library owns would be more likely to appear in a holdings record. The bibliographic record, in theory, should be neutral, which means it should match, in terms of description, the item as it comes from the publisher. So if yours is missing pages when you get it, that would not go into the bibliographic record unless all copies of that particular title are missing pages. So it's really based upon sort of a neutral approach to cataloging. Now it gets more complicated than that, but that's in theory. When you are copy cataloging and you go out there and you look in OCLC to find a record that matches, it should match what appears on your particular title. And if it doesn't, that means your record, you're not looking at the right record. You need to keep going. But we'll talk a little bit more about how that varies, which is unfortunate. So MARC bibliographic records can look a lot of different ways. It depends upon how you're looking at them and what software you're using. So you see here we have a lot of dollar signs. We're going to talk about that symbol in just a minute and all the various ways it can be reflected, but I just kind of wanted to give you a sense of, MARC records can look different depending on the system and software you're using. It does not mean that the information is different itself. It just means that presentation of it to you is different. Another example of it. Now we're going to start talking a little bit about how things display in the catalog. So that is what you put into a record and how it shows up to the public. And that's the essence of what display means. In some fields, and this is a challenge when you're starting to work between like maybe a discovery layer and you want some things to display and some things not to display. Some fields, the indicators, and these are the first two numbers, and we're going to look at those in just a second. The indicators will sometimes, for some fields, say display or not display. That's what they're defined to do. So there's a MARC 21 group that has existed for years and years, and they are the ones that define, and working with the cataloging community as a whole, they're the ones who define what our MARC fields are and what each of those subfields and indicators do. And we're actually going to go through some of these in just a minute. But indicators can be one of the things that impact whether or not something displays in your catalog. There are other things that can impact it too. You can actually say turn off this whole field or not, depending upon your system. The labels are the terms that we use to define and when things are displayed. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But you see over here on the left, we have a bunch of numbers. And then when you look over here on the right side, you see we have just very sort of easy to understand labels. So we have title, we have author, we have subjects, we have contents. Over here on the left, title, author, subjects, contents does not appear. So what the system is doing is it's taking the field for title and it's saying, rather than show a 245 to our patrons, we're going to show the word title. So typically this is one of the things that you can change in your ILS. If you do not like the label that appears to your patrons, you know, typically this is one of the things you could change. You could say, I don't want it to say title, I want it to say name of the book. I don't know what you would want it to say, but whatever it is you might want to say. For example, rather than saying author, you might want to say creator. That would be one that would be easier to probably figure out. So indexing. So what's the I've already talked a little bit about display. So what's the difference between indexing and display? So, you know, MARC is an older system, and it really goes through how MARC is expects a machine or a computer to read it is really from the top to the bottom, and it expects that each single spot in that record communicates information. So MARC is considered to be position-based, so it starts from the top of a record and it goes all the way to the bottom of the record, and each position is accounted for in some way. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means kind of going forward, but basically what it means is that when MARC expects to be searched, there are things in the record that will say index this, which means search this field, create an index for it so that people can say browse by title, browse by call number, you know, that kind of thing, browse by author. That is that purpose of indexing. So go in, search it, index it, create that index for it so that people can do a browse by author or browse by title. Sometimes the indexing is determined by those MARC indicators, and we'll look at some examples of that. If it's not indexed, and this is a decision between the ILS and your MARC records, so you may set this up or your vendor may set this up to say, okay, you have a browse by author, that would be index the 100 fields or the 1XX fields. We'll talk about those in a second, but it would be index those, so you have a browse by author. Or it could be that it's something that you configure, or that your vendor may give you a list of indexes and you can choose which ones you want to turn on or off. That's all defined by your MARC tags and in some cases your indicators. And we'll talk about what those things mean in just a minute. But if a MARC field's not indexed, so if a MARC field doesn't create that index and say like you can browse by the author, or you can browse by title, or you can browse by call number, browse by series, browse by subject heading, those are some of the most common ones that you would have, you can still search by keyword. Most systems will now allow keyword searching, and if you just put in something like you would in Google, it'll give you some results. Some of the older ILSs, your mileage may vary on some of this. For some of you who are very old ILSs, or maybe built something yourselves, it may not do all the things that I'm mentioning. So I'll try to keep that in mind. But if a MARC field's not indexed, then it may still be searchable by keyword. That would be kind of like what we do with Google. And this is kind of one of those reasons why relevance ranking is complicated in ILSs, because we have this ability to have a index where it actually browses those and kind of says these are more important. So that's what relevance ranking is. So for example, if you say we have a browse by subject headings, we're going to consider a subject heading to have a heavier weight. It's more important. So if someone types in dogs, then, and they don't choose, they're not choosing any kind of advanced searching or anything, they're just keyword searching, they just put in dogs, then anything that has a subject heading of dogs would get more of a weight and would come up higher in the list. And that's true of Google in theory too. It has the relevance ranking, where if you type in dogs in Google, it'll look through all the things out there on the web that has access to. And of course, there's things it doesn't, because there's the dark web where things are not indexable in Google and do not show up in Google. But the things that do show up in Google, the things that you have access to in Google, if you type in dogs, they would filter up to the top. Now, Google does not have the same way of indexing that we do. In the early days of Google, they tried to do keywords, where they would look at the keywords, and the keywords that the person who created the website, or the metadata person, or whoever it was, the SEO person, that search engine optimization person. They put in keywords, and those in theory would be like our subject headings, similar to our subject heading. So Google weighted those higher. So what happened with that? Well, people abuse them. So in the earlier days of the web, and still happens today, but not so much, but in the earlier days of the web, you could type dogs and you could, think you were looking at a website with dogs, and, you might end up someplace you did not want to be that has nothing to do with dogs, because somebody put dogs as a keyword, and then they sent, the website itself was completely different. It could be about cooking or whatever. This happened a lot with adult naughty websites. So in those early days, if you kind of, if you ever searched the early web or the early days of the web and you wondered, like, why did I get to this website, or how did I get to this website? It has nothing to do with my topic. There was lots of practices to redirect people to websites, because the more hits you get, the more views you get, the more popular your website is, that also makes it rank higher in Google. So there's a lot of, as they called it, black hat practices that happened, especially in the early days of the website, web development, which impacted how Google indexes things. So when Google first started out, and most search engines are the same, other search engines are the same way, when they first started out, they were more similar to the way our records did. They were looking for keywords, they were looking for things and weighting those things as more important. They now have a very sophisticated algorithm that puts a lot of different things together to put those top searches together. One being, of course, whether or not you've paid to have your search rank higher, whether or not you're a reputable website and have existed for a long time, how many people link to you, all kinds of things, much beyond just whether or not the word appears. So we've kind of deviated a little bit from the way the larger web works in terms of our resources. That impacts whether or not our resources show up in Google. As libraries, as EDUs and nonprofits, our websites have a tendency to rank higher anyway, because we are considered to be credible, authoritative resources. But when you start getting into that individual book level thing, there's a lot of reasons why our records don't show up beyond MARC, but MARC is part of it. So display then, in terms of our records, is just whether or not a field displays in the OPAC and how. That's all that means. So for example, here's a good example. We have 3 new fields under RDA, 336, 337, and 338. These are meant to really define the format, and they apply to all different kinds of resources. And these 3 fields, because as you can see, I know it's kind of hard to see in this little screenshot, but these 3 fields are very text code oriented, and they're really meant for the computer and not really meant for human eyeballs. So you can see this weird unmediated thing here. We're going to talk about that more as we get to that field, but we can have these fields searchable by format, but not actually displaying to people. So we could have this as a search option where people could actually search for example, I want a print book. You can now define print books or print serials, whatever print, from the electronic content. It's a little bit easier to kind of define those things. But we can tell our system not to display those. Now, it's kind of on or off for this field, so you can either have these 3 fields display or maybe be searchable by formatting, or you can say don't display them, don't search them. Some ILSs I know are still struggling what to do with these fields. They are newer, they've been out for a few years now, so hopefully your ILS has made some progress on this if they haven't already. The easiest answer is just to map them to say search by format and include these fields as part of that search. So here's another example of that. MARC record, and we're going to talk more about the MARC parts of it, but we're just kind of talking about how it displays in the OPAC right now. We have a series title, which goes in the 490 field. We're going to talk more about fields in a minute. And, this can be useful information. We have critical companions to popular contemporary writers, and then it has a number down there. But, our users do not know code jargon, And, you know, some of us don't know code jargon either. So, you know, knowing a 490, whatever, it's more helpful sometimes to kind of figure out what we should call it. We know it's a series field if we look it up, or we know that to be true, but do our patrons even know what a series is? Some of them do, some of them don't. So maybe we would want to say that it's a series to tell people that. Or maybe we just want to say, hey, these are related titles, or it's part of this, or something else. So, you know, that's one of the things that we do when we're kind of looking at the, you know, sort of looking at the back end and the front end of our records. Now, I will say if you've not done this a lot, or maybe you did it a long time ago when you were learning and you haven't spent time doing this lately, take some time and, you know, you could find something you've cataloged or whatever. It doesn't have to be what you've cataloged. You may want to try a few different formats. Find the record on the back end and then go find the record on your public interface. Or for those of you who don't have access to the back end, maybe find a record, you know, you could find a record just on the public side, and then you're going to look at that MARC display that you can see. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that in a minute. So here's another view from a different OPAC. So lots of different OPACs. You notice there's similarities, but they all look a little bit different beyond the branding and all that kind of stuff. So this is a book. And again, we're looking at those labels instead of the MARC tags. So we have author, title, edition, publisher, description, subjects. You know, we have that information. So, you know, what you can look at here is really looking at, you know, how those fields display in the OPAC. And these may be different in your ILS. So that might be interesting to kind of go in, look at your ILS, or look at an ILS at the library. If you're really not sure what ILS to look at, you don't have access to one, just go to the Library of Congress and look at their ILS, because you can easily see the MARC records by looking at the technical view, and you can see the front end too. So it's a really good system to kind of look at, but you know, take some time to look at it. And this is really how you learn MARC. You learn it by, you know, creating records. You learn it by looking at records. You learn it by having to figure out what you need to fix before you migrate. You know, that's how you learn this information. So for the other things I want to note is for the examples that I'm giving you, we're going to kind of skip through them, but please do take some time to go back and look at the examples. And also, like I said, do that ILS exercise where you're looking at the public view of the record and then looking at that MARC view of the record, because that is so much how you learn this. So we're going to break these down in terms of exactly what the parts of a record are, because this is really an important piece, especially if you're moving records back and forth. So the leader is at the top of a MARC record, and depending on what kind of system you're using, you may or may not be able to see this information. So we're going to talk about what that is and look at it in just a minute. This leader code, as it's called, or codes, because there's multiples in there, this helps the software to recognize the record and know what it is, to know more about it. This is very old programming style stuff. For those of you who work with the institutional repositories, digital libraries, or web sort of stuff, you can think of this as the administrative and system metadata. So this information is typically created in the process of cataloging, and some of the information is not input by the cataloger at all. It's completely created by the system. So this is really that administrative metadata. You know, what kind of record is this? What format is the MARC field or the MARC record? What kind of library input this record? You know, what is the what quality is that MARC record according to that library? What input standards did they use? So it's all of that kind of administrative data part of it, really, to talk about the record. The fixed fields then, this is the data in these fields are fixed in length. So that means there is no, there's no free text here. You're not typing in anything you just want here. You are inputting information in a specific format. And this is to assist in retrieval and data manipulation. So for example, the date year is always coded as YYY. So, you know, like 1968 would be the date in one of the date fields. So there are specific fields in this category, and they are defined in a very specific way. So, you know, if you have a book that was published in 1968, you don't type in 68, you have to type in 1968. You don't type in, you know, if it's published in July 1968, you do not put the July in, it's just 1968. So, you know, it is very specific in terms of what you choose. These fields are tagged as 006, 007, and 008, and we'll talk about these more in just a minute. But these fields are things where you have a defined list. Country code, what country is this book published in? You have a coded list that you choose from. If you're in the United States, you are choosing off a list and it will tell you the city and then the country. So for example, New York City is NYU. That is your choice when you're coding for country. So it's pick off a list, which in some ways makes it easy, right? Because you're picking off a list. If you use OCLC, this is a drop-down list, so it makes it much easier to just go in and choose what you need to. Variable fields. This is really the heart or the guts of the bibliographic record. So for those of you who are copy cataloging, this is where you're spending most of your time. The data in these fields vary in length, which means they may be longer. You know, that field may be longer than from one record to another. So for example, in the fixed field areas, you know, the year is always 4 digits, Y, 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 Y. But when you get down to the variable field, when you're recording the information about dates or publisher or something like that, you may have additional information that makes that field a little bit longer. Physical description is an example of a variable field, and we'll look more about that. Many of these are indexed, you know, are indexed as access points. So I did warn you we were going to talk about ISBD. This is the International Standardized Bibliographic Description, and this is all of the punctuation that's in the records. So if you haven't spent time looking at a record and noticing this, this is another thing you can just take a few minutes to look at. Gosh, this has been around for a long time too, and it's meant to provide punctuation to make the cards, and now records, more human readable. So when you're printing cards, back in the olden days for people printing cards, those pieces of punctuation were meant to help separate on the card visually those pieces of data. So when you had those card catalogs, they did not have all the MARC fields on them. So if you took a MARC record and you printed your card catalog, it did not have all the MARC fields on it, didn't have all those numbers on it. It would just have the punctuation. So things like this, all of this punctuation here. So, you know, the commas, the brackets, all that punctuation. Punctuation. So just take a minute, look at a record. You'll notice it. Once you start looking, you'll see it. It's something that if you're cataloging, you just sort of probably do without thinking about. You probably don't think too much about it not being a MARC thing, but it's not a MARC thing. It was really meant to make our records easier to read. And on these card catalogs that did not have all the MARC fields, it helped us see where MARC fields ended, where the subfields ended, things like that. So let's look at a MARC record, kind of break these things out. We have a variable field here, and you can see our MARC tag. The MARC tag is those three digits right there at the front. We have our indicators. If you look down here at the 050, we have our indicator first position. You remember I said position based, each thing counts. First position is 1 in this case, second position is 4. Those are defined from our MARC manual. It actually defines every single one of these. And this provides information about that field and direction sometimes to the ILS. Up here at the top, it is really hard sometimes to see the leader information and all of the leader information, all of those fixed fields up there. And you can see they kind of look different when you look at different records. But if you look up in the leader, you can actually see that there's a little S up there. That actually tells you that this is a serial record. So for those of you who are copy cataloging, this is, I'll show you a couple of areas as we go along that are good places to check, because people sometimes, if they're deriving records or cloning records, so in OCLC, you can actually take an existing record, you can make a copy of it to kind of start, you know, making your new record. Sometimes people, it's kind of a good cheat shortcut. Sometimes people forget to change things, and I'll kind of point those out as we go along. One thing you may look is when you're looking at your leader, if you can see that information in whatever system you're using, you will see you know, some various code here, but you'll see an S or an M, of course M being for monographic kind of items, S being for a serial type of item. So when you're then looking down at your record here, you should see things that reflect that essence of a serial record. And we'll talk a little bit more about some things that I'll point out to you. There's subfields here, and we're actually going to look at subfields in just a minute. A subfield further defines a MARC field or tag. So you start with a MARC tag that's 3 digits. Then you have places or positions for 2 indicators. You notice here some fields don't have indicators. That means they're undefined, or there's nothing that has been defined for that. There's no function or information that's been defined for that particular field. So some have indicators, some do not. So I already talked a little bit about this. This just kind of gives you a more visual presentation of it. Variable field, you have 3-digit tags, and those are identified by a number, 100, 245, 300, whatever. They're roughly grouped together numerically by function. So for example, 6XX, the 600 range is all related to subject headings of some type. And then, so you have your 3-digit MARC tag, and then you have your 2 single-digit indicators, first position, second position, indicator 1, indicator 2, first indicator, second indicator, whatever you call them. And these are where you get your codes for indexing, card production, other system functions. Code may be displayed as a number. It may be displayed as a blank, and being position-based, if you look at older formatting or you look at older documentation, it'll have a little B with a line drawn through it. That stands for blank. That is a very old way of designating blank. Sometimes you'll see, more likely in my stuff, you'll see it blank, or you'll see an underscore to indicate a blank, means it's a blank. Everything has a meaning in a MARC record. Every tag, every subfield, every indicator means something. An indicator not there also means something. So it means that there is no function assigned with that. And then you have 1 or more subfields. So you may have many, many subfields, and these are all defined. The subfield is the smallest logical unit of data in those fields. It's usually for text, and sometimes it contains a few codes, and we'll talk a little bit as we go along about that. It's usually a lowercase letter. There's a couple of places today where it's not, and I'll show you what those are and talk about them. It is defined by this MARC standard. It is defined in our MARC manual. It's preceded by a subfield delimiter, and the delimiter is called that little like double plus, that's called a double dagger. That's what OCLC typically uses. That's what many of our ILSs uses if we're on the back end. You may see it as a $sign if you're using connection in the web-based, or you're using a web browser to do your work. It's more likely going to turn into a $sign, or it will turn into a long stem or pipe, as they're called in web development. The first subfield in most fields, almost all fields, there's a couple of exceptions, almost all fields is A, but it does not display an OCLC. So if you are trying to migrate records back and forth and you're having issues and you have some data in a MARC field and there's no subfield A in those tags, that may be one place that is causing, that may be one place that's causing an issue if you don't have that subfield A as your first subfield for that particular field, depending on how your system is able to handle things. So this is my little handy dandy MARC graph I came up with a while ago. I still like it, still use it. There's your 245 MARC tag, your first indicator, second indicator. There's your delimiter with your subfield B, and you can see some punctuation here with the periods and the colon and things like that. We are going to talk, we'll talk more about ISBD towards the end because we have some new developments about ISBD we can talk about. RDA, if you go in and look and read RDA, if you've been looking at RDA, although a lot of the examples that we see are using MARC fields because that's what so many of us are using, RDA is meant to be neutral completely of that, because RDA is looking at our metadata as a whole to represent all the different kinds of metadata that we use and not just MARC. And it's also looking past MARC. So it's meant to be neutral of ISBD and MARC punctuation. So you'll hear me say XX a lot, and that just means that range. So since MARC is position-based, each space is accounted for in the system. That means each field is accounted for even if it's not used. So 1XX means the range from 100 to 199. When MARC records first came out, they had a limit of 9,999 characters. That limit has been obliterated, but there are still various places where we encounter limits at times. We do not use all of the fields. You know, there's not 999 fields that we use plus subfields A to Z in every, every piece. So there are places where we don't use all the fields. We're still adding fields. We're going to talk about some of those in just a minute. And once a field is obsolete, we do not reuse it. It's marked as obsolete and we do not use that field again. I guess unless we wanted to revive it. And if we were reviving it, I don't know of any that's been revived though. MARC resources, I have a nice cheat sheet for you. The other thing you might want to check out, my go-to favorite is the oclc.org bib formats. Bib formats, a lot of us just call it. You can search by field. It has a lot of great examples, and we're going to talk just a little tiny bit about it. The Library of Congress MARC page is the actual heart or hub of all the MARC stuff. And OCLC, but I think OCLC's version is a little bit easier to use. So those are the resources for your Look It Up Club because you're going to want to use it. Common MARC fields, our 000 fields are what's called control numbers. That's where your ISBN is and some other things. 100, personal author, personal creator. That is an authorized access point. So that means that you're using what is in the authority record or you're following the format for how to create a name according to our authority standards. 110, so 110 is part of that 1XX range. 110 is the corporate author, so it's a group of people. We'll talk more about those in a minute. 245, title. 246, variant title. 260 has now moved to a 264. If you have 260s in your catalog still, it's fine to keep them there. If you want to change them to something else, you'll need to think about it a little bit more, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. 300 field, physical description, is now sort of has a companion in the 336 and 338, and we'll talk about the difference between those in a second. For your series, the 440, if you have those still, you really need to change those because 440 is obsolete. Unlike the 260, which is not obsolete yet, I do think it will become obsolete one day, but it's not obsolete yet. The 440 is obsolete. If you have an ILS and it's still able to search and index those and it's not a problem, then I don't think you really need to change them. But If you're looking to migrate systems, then you probably need to decide what you're going to do with those. Your vendor, if you're migrating and you're getting help from your vendor, they may be able to just map these without you having to do anything. So not saying you have to do the work, but you may have to. 500 or the 5XX, that's the whole range of notes. And we're going to talk about notes because I love them. And then our 6XX is our subject headings, and our 7XX is added entries where we can add extra names. And we'll talk a little bit about those too. Transcription fields. I talked about these earlier. 245, 250, 260, 490. Transcription fields do not apply to any field that has authorized access points. Why not? You may think like, well, why wouldn't it? Because you're getting that information from your authoritative resource. So you're getting the form of the name from the authority record. You are getting the subject heading from whatever thesaurus you're using. Might be the Library of Congress subject headings, it might be Sears, it might be a genre, it might be FAST, whatever you're using for your subject headings, but you're getting it from that list, so you're following that list. Capitalization, transcribe it if in a transcription field. So in a 245, capitalization, RDA would say, transcribe it as it appears on the piece. Now, those of you who've done RDA stuff, you know that this was a big deal when it came out, and boy, do I remember the arguments about this. You can use your own style guide, and I think that's what most of us do, but we'll talk a little bit about why that option is important in a minute. Ellipses, transcribe them as they are. And then for typos, we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a little bit, because in the olden days, if there was a typo in the title field, we would do like sick or IE. We always did IE at my library, IE. So, you know, if they spelled United, untied, it was supposed to be United States and it was untied states, but it was spelled wrong on the book. We would do IE and we'd fix it, you know, write United next to it. RDA, you do not do that anymore. For monographs, for books, you record it as it appears on your item, on your title page, and then we're going to talk more about this. You're going to record the correct version elsewhere, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. For serials, you do it the other way around, because for serials, it's typically just an issue that has a misspelling. So we'll talk a little bit more about typos in cataloging versus typos in publishing as we go along. I'll try to remember to talk about that. Control numbers, I'm not going to go through every one of these as we talk about these kind of groups. I just wanted to give you sort of a short list you can look at. So this is something that, you know, as you're kind of looking at things, looking at your MARC records, this can be useful to kind of take a look at some of the list I have too. 1XX, this is where your creator goes. And this is that authorized access point. So it comes from your authority source. Typically the national authority file, the virtual internet authority file if you need to access an authority file and you don't participate in some kind of authority program. If there is at least one person or a corporate entity, so a corporate entity includes meetings and conferences, all that kind of stuff, listed as the creator of the work, you will have a 1XX field. 1XX is not repeatable, so you can't have more than one. You can only have one of these in your field, and it's also not required. So if you don't have anyone listed as an author or creator, you do not have to put this in your field, in your record. However, it does impact the coding of the 245. And this is a thing that you copy catalogers can just check very quickly, and it is very important. So it impacts the display and it impacts the findability depending upon your system. So for example, you know, what does a field look like that would be a 100 field? There's me. 100, first indicator, 1, inverted name, Faye, comma, Robin M. If you have more than one, let's say you have a whole list of authors, when you're looking at a title page, when you get to other things, it becomes a little more challenging sometimes, but when you're looking at a title page, the first author listed in that list of authors is considered to be the primary author. All of the other authors go in a 700 field if they're people. So, you know, the publisher in theory has chosen the primary author to be the first one in the list. Now, if they decide to list everybody alphabetically, but they really meant that John Smith was the primary author, you're still going to go with that first person in the list because there's no way you're going to know what the publisher meant. So you go with what is in the list if you have a list of people. So the authorized access point, we used to call this main entry way back in the day. Some of us still occasionally call it main entry. This is who or what has primary, intellectual, artistic, or creative responsibility for the content. This is the people who have made this thing that you are cataloging. 100 is a personal name, 110 is a corporate name, 111 is a conference or meeting. If you have a 100 field or 110 or 111, any one XX field, then your 245 will be a first indicator. Let me make sure I'm getting this right. Your first indicator 0. Your 100 field will be your 100 indicator will tell you the order of the name, and then your 245, your first indicator will be 1. I've got it backwards. Anyway, we're going to look at examples in just a minute. This maps over to your authors and creators. Your first indicator in your 100 field will tell you the order. Typically, you're going to see a first indicator of 1 because that's going to be a single name, and you're going to follow, you know, the order of it. Then you have all of these subfields, and remember that subfield A is often not hidden, is often hidden. That's where you're just going to have the person's name. So for mine, it's just, you know, Faye, comma, Robin M. You also have other things that you may have. And then the one thing that you as copy catalogers will not see when you look in the authority record, but it is something you can add, is the subfield E, which is that relationship or relator designator. And this is where you would add author, illustrator, that kind of thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. So some examples, and notice I put those subfield E's in there. 100, first indicator 1, so we have the last name first, so that inverted name, and then subfield E, author, because these are all authors. You can see here some of the other subfields that are there. So this is pretty typical what we see when we're looking at a MARC record, right? The author's name, and then you may or may not have these in your catalog, that subfield E. It really depends upon whether or not you've had them. If you are copy cataloging and you see them in an OCLC record, I would say leave them in unless they're causing a problem in your system. If they're causing a problem in your system, that might be a conversation to have. If they're not causing a problem in your system, certainly leave them. If you want to add them in at the point of copy cataloging, you can. That's something you would just need to kind of think about, or if you have other, you know, you have a system or department or someplace where you talk about cataloging things, then that may be something that you would kind of talk about as a group and figure out, do you want to add them or not? You're picking off a list from RDA. So author, there you go. That's what you put for an author. I've given you that one. Performer, that's what you put for musicians. You know, most kind of musician performer kinds of people. So, you know, it's a list that you pick off of. Examples of conference meetings. You know, same sort of thing. The subfields tell you exactly what the information will be. And corporate names, corporate body is just a group of persons as creators. So it's called corporate name or corporate body, which I hope at some point we change this, because I know under RDA we're looking to change the terminology for the larger group of people as creators. So I'm hopeful that corporate name or corporate body will go away soon, because it has nothing to do with whether or not you make money or whether or not you're a corporation. It has nothing to do with that. It's just group of people as creators. So this could be a nonprofit, it could be your library, it could be the local historical society, it can be your local university, it can be Microsoft. You know, it can be any group of people together who are creating something that you are acquiring for your library. Some examples of 110s and 111s. Again, we're not going to go through all of these. They are, if you look down here at the Winter Olympic Games, these are all defined with the subfields to tell you exactly what you need to do, and you're really just following what is in the authority file. So if you look up the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railway, that is the format that you will find in the authority record. You remember when I said if you had other people, what do you do with them? Well, you're going to add them in those 700 fields if it's a personal name, 710 if it's a corporate group of people, 711 if it's a meeting. So if you have more than one creator and you're trying to figure out like where am I going to put the rest of them, you know, because I can only have 100 field, one 100 field or one 110 field. I can only have one 1x field. Where do I put the rest of them? You're going to put them in one of these 7xx fields. The other thing is, like if you're cataloging movies or DVDs, you know, that kind of thing, and you have all these performers and actors and creators and, you know, you're going to take all of those performers, all the cast, as many of them as you want, and you're going to put them in the appropriate 7xx fields. So, you know, that's why when you're looking at DVD records, some of them list like every single cast member and like there's the key grip and there's the scenery painter, and then others only list, you know, just the director and maybe like the top 2 or 3 actors or actresses. So, you know, it really is up to the cataloger who's cataloging those resources in terms of how far in depth they want to go in terms of listing these added names. Best practices say to list as many people as you can in terms of, you know, what appears on the resource. So you're not going to certainly watch the movie and watch every single part of it to figure out every single person. You're really just going to look at, you know, what your credits say, what the movie titles say, all that kind of stuff. You're just going to look at the resources that you have. 245, every record must have a 245. You cannot put a record into OCLC without a 245, and most systems will just plain out reject it if you don't have a 245. So the indicators really just tell you, they just match whether or not you have that indexing. So the whether or not you have that 100 field. So if you have a 245, then you're going to, and you have a 1xx field, it's going to be 1. And I think I have that backwards on my slide, so I need to clarify that. And then your second indicator impacts indexing. Now this is only about browsing by title in terms of impacting indexing. So for example, we'll look at some examples in just a second, but this is a transcription field. So this is record it as you see it on your piece under RDA. So this is a big change from RDA in our previous cataloging rules. So if you're a copy cataloger and you're cataloging something older, cataloging something from even the 80s, if that record has not been updated and is not an RDA record, then what appears for the 245 might not match exactly what you have on your title page. If you're cataloging something from, say, 2010 on, what is on that record should match exactly what is on your title page. If it doesn't, you need to look more carefully at it. Here's some common subfields. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these. We used to use something in our title fields called the GMD, the General Material Designator or designation. And this is what we used to use for non-print material. So in the olden days, and there's still some of this floating around in OCLC and elsewhere, though I think OCLC stripped most of it by now. We just assumed that print was the default, and then we just sort of talked about the other stuff. So we talked about electronic resources, we talked about sound recordings, but we just assumed everything else was print. Under RDA, We got rid of the GMD because it was very general, like sound recording. Well, that's about as helpful as what? I mean, yeah, you know it's sound, but is it a DVD or is it a streaming MP3 or, you know, what is it? There really wasn't any additional information, very limited in terms of what it was. So we got rid of the GMD because it was just a text string for one thing. So it wasn't very easy for a system to index it and do anything with it. And we also didn't have anything for print. So it's like print's the default and everything else is the oddities. Well, of course, that's not the way the world is these days. Almost, you know, so much more of our material is digital or something else. And then we have less and less print. So we got rid of the GMD, but we created these new fields, 336, 337, 338, and these are fairly granular in terms of describing the content, but they also are for print. So now we don't just assume print's the default, we actually define things as being print. And we'll look at that when we get to those fields. But just to let you know, if you have the subfield H in your records, this will be another area to kind of think about, because you're going to need to at some point make a decision, possibly when you migrate, but maybe before, in terms of what you're going to do with those. So talked a little bit about indexing, MARC position, being position-based. This is one place where you can really see that MARC is position-based, meaning every single position is accounted for, including spaces. So in terms of our indexing, and like I said, these are the two things as a copy cataloger you can easily check for. If you have a 100 field and you have a person's name, is it coded with a 1 if the name is inverted? That's an easy one to check. If you have a 100 field, is your 245 first indicator 1? If it is, then green light. If it's a 0 and you have a 100 field, then it needs to be changed to 1. And then this is the other easy thing you can kind of check, and it's kind of a fun thing because you get to count. So it's kind of like a little puzzle. So our second indicator tells us where the title actually starts. We don't consider the titles to start with leading articles like a, an, or the. So we want it, if you're browsing by title, we don't want to browse by the, right? We want to browse by broker. So we're going to count over positions for that. So again, this is where you can really see that MARC is position-based. We would want to count over. So T is 1, H is 2, E is 3, space, because MARC is position-based, 4. The title starts 4 positions over at broker. This is true for all titles that start with the letter the. So actually some people just know, like, oh, if it's the, it's going to be 4. But it's just pretty easy to kind of count over. So this is a thing that people miss a lot of times when they're cloning or deriving records. They just forget to change that indicator. And there's really no way to kind of check that. There's the MARC validation stuff doesn't actually check that part of it. So like I said, that's an easy thing to kind of check. If you're trying to migrate records from like an institutional repository or digital library, this is a pretty tricky thing to kind of figure out, because your Dublin core, whatever you're using, is probably not accounting for these indicators. So you'll need to figure that out in your migration part of it. Examples of 1XX 245 pairs. We're just going to kind of skip through some things here. 246 is the variant form of the title. This is where you can add a note for what's called title added entry. And this is where we cover our typos. It's also where you can kind of cover, like, what's on the spine is different from what's on the title page. You know, they do that all the time, especially if you're in, you know, higher ed and you get some kind of long title on the inside and the spine's like really short. This is where you can account for those differences. And this is very, very useful. If you are cataloging movies or any kind of media like that, websites especially is another good example, but movies, anything that's a moving image kind of thing, streaming media would be another example. For streaming media and for movies, what is on those title screens that you see is your source of information. That's considered to be like your title page. So you are not supposed to catalog from containers or the publisher's information or any of that other kind of stuff. I know. But can you catalog from that? Yes. And most, I wouldn't say most people, I don't want to say most, many people do catalog, especially for DVDs and VHS tapes and things like that. They do catalog from the container. If you catalog from the container, please, if you're doing original cataloging from the container, please use a 246 and a 245 so that, and a 500 note to tell the rest of us where you got your information from. Because if we get something where the container changed, but the actual DVD did not change, they just reprinted the container and maybe they changed the title on the container, but there's a mismatch, then as a copy cataloger, that's much more challenging to be able to know that I do have the same thing, the packaging just changed, but the thing itself is the same. And that happens more with movies and that kind of media than it does with anything else. Websites are similar, where you're looking at something that's essentially a snapshot, and we need to know when you looked at it and if the title was different on any other place on the website. So that if we're looking at that same website, same thing with electronic resources, any difference a title, we need to know that there's another title there and what it might be and where you got that information. Because as a copy cataloger, that just saves us time to know that we have the same thing you do. And even as someone who's doing original cataloging, if I'm to the point of trying to figure out, do I need to input a new record? If you have cataloged from information that is not on that particular resource, and you've not noted that any place in your record with a note, I'm not going to know that you've made that decision. And I may input a new record, and I did not need to do that at all. So I am a big fan of notes, as you can see, and help your cataloging colleagues out. On all sides, because we don't want a bunch of duplicate records when it's the same thing because someone used information from a different resource. So there's my soapbox. I'm off of it. But this is also where we put information about typos. So remember I said you record it as it appears on the piece now? We have the brick house. It's supposed to be the brick house. We add a 246 for what the title should be. And for serials, we're going to do the opposite. For serials, we're going to record it as the title as a whole. And then we'd add a 246 for that typo, because the typo is probably just on one issue. Now, if the typo keeps appearing and appearing and appearing, at that point, you may actually have more of a title change. But I think typos are pretty easy to see. This is an area where there's the difference between what's a typo in the cataloging versus what is a typo from the publisher. Under RDA, we should be recording typos from the publisher because that is what appears on the item. So if someone goes to pull it off the shelf, we want to make sure that what's on the title matches what's in that title field, but then we want to account for that difference in a title. 246, I've given you lots of indicators, and no note. Note means that I'm going to add a note as part of this. So I'm going to choose one of these things like for, and then I'm going to give additional information for that second indicator. So first indicator tells you whether or not you're going to use a second indicator with a note. So for example, the one note added entry, that means I would be using a 1, and then I'm going to use like spine title, and it's going to print or show title on spine or something like that. Some examples, you can also use it when you have ampersands, when you have numbers in the title, anything that might not index properly. I use this sometimes when I have like chemical equation kind of things to try to explain to people, what it was a little bit better. So you can use that 246 for that kind of things. Sometimes things will be really different, or you'll have additional information. So what may be on the container, here's an example of a sound recording, and it has a different title on the container. And if I were a copy cataloger trying to decide if I should input a new record, if I had something and it says live at the International New Jazz Festival, when I pop it in, you know, to listen at it, and I'm looking at the label on this thing, and it all matches live at the International New Jazz Festival, and everything about this matches this record, then I could just assume I can use this record. Not sure, you know, what these fields mean. You're going to check bibliographics, formats, and standards, and you'll notice that they'll say NR or R. That's for repeatable or not repeatable. Not repeatable means you can only use that field once. And then here's all of our indicators down here. And required, if applicable, just means if this appears on your piece, then you should use that field, subfield. 250 field is the addition statement. This is a transcription field. This is a change from what we've done in the past. Indicators, there's none, blanks. So again, if you're cataloging something older, then this is going to be, it's going to be different possibly. But if you're cataloging something, say from 2013 or 12-ish on, it should match what is on your piece. If it doesn't match, if the, like it said, second was spelled out versus two, you know, I would say depending on what year that was, that might be acceptable and just kind of let it go, because at least your addition statements match. If you have the third edition and the record you're looking at is for the second edition, that is not a match at all. But in theory, it should be transcription from now on. So if you're doing original cataloging, you're going to follow what's on your piece. 260 is now moving to a 264. You'll see a lot more 264s on records these days. We now can break this out into production, publication, distribution, manufacture, and copyright. If you are looking to flip your 260s into something else, you just want to convert them so you have a 264, you could use production. So you could use that 264 and then your first indicator 0 for production, but then you would need to see if you have any copyright. So we used to use C, the little C for copyright in records, and if you have a C, then you're going to use the copyright for that, which is a 264-4, and you'll use a subfield C for that. So some examples of that. And you can do this in some different ways. For catalogers, you are looking for one 264 that matches your record. So this can be a little bit of a challenge if you're migrating records or you're trying to, you know, take like a Dublin Core record and put it into your ILS or to map it up into the ILS, because under MARC now we have a lot more choices in terms of how we record, but you just need one complete 264. You see here the 264 subfield C. That's one place where we don't have an hidden subfield A. So for the copyright symbol, because it starts with that date position, which is defined as a subfield C, that's the only information you put into a copyright field. It's in that 264-4, and it's a subfield C. Again, take some time, look at some records, spend some time with the examples, because that's how you learn these things. If you do not know, you know, if you have place of publication unknown, you just don't know. In the olden days, we used Latin, sine loco, no place of publication, sine nomo, no place, no publisher, and then no date. So we would use Latin for that. We've nixed Latin out of RDA, unless of course the item is in Latin. If your library is a classical library, you may have a lot of that. But we can either choose two options. Well, there's a little bit more choice here, but basically two options. You can basically explain in brackets, I don't know, place of publication not identified, place of publication unknown. This is free text, so there are some sort of best practices in terms of how to record this, but really you can kind of type what you want in those fields as long as it makes sense to your patrons. or you can make an educated guess. So for example, let's say I have committee papers from the Georgia State University Libraries Promotion Committee. And the dates of these papers are dated 2013. You know, there's no copyright associated with them. There's no publisher associated with them, but I can look at these papers and I know, you know, okay, this is the Georgia State University Libraries Committee, so that's probably the publisher, right? I can make a pretty good guess of that. And I know that Georgia State is in Atlanta, Georgia, so you know, they have some other branches in Georgia, so might not be Atlanta, but most likely to be Atlanta. And 2013 appears as a date in these papers, so I can guess that 2013 is probably a good guesstimate. So RDA would say if you can make a good guesstimate, you have a good sense of when it might be. And if I knew it was in the 2000s, but I wasn't sure, you know, exactly when it is, I could even guess that. So RDA would say, if you can make an estimated guess, go for it. If you really have no idea whatsoever, then just use like place of publication, not identified. This does give us much more flexibility in searching. So that's one of the things you might take a look at is like how those dates, you know, appear, and, you know, just take a look, especially for some of your media, because that may be interesting. AACR2 used lots and lots of abbreviations. RDA only uses abbreviations in units of measurements, or if it appears abbreviated in a transcription field. So we now spell things out. Again, there's our unit of measurement that's truncated. Everything else is not. Mentioned the GMD before. Here's another example of the GMD. So here we're taking video recording, which is what used to be in there for, you know, all different kinds of video recordings. And in this case, we have a DVD. So we're going to replace it with the 336, 337, and 338. This is a list that we pick off of. So there are those three fields, and that is a list you pick off. And again, this is a more technical list, so you can sort of more technical codey kind of jargon. So you can hide this from your ILS if you need to, if it's not going to appear. And then a couple of other new fields. This one is one of the newest fields, is the 341, which is for accessible content. And this is where you can put captioning and things like that. There are some other fields to look at if you're cataloging digital content, especially either digital video, or so digital video or other digital content would be 347 would be one thing to look at. If you are cataloging VHS tapes, then you would look at the 346 because that is analog video characteristics, so that would be the place you could record that. And then 345 initially was used for digital, you know, for digital movies, DVDs, things like that. But it really is meant for, it's been redefined as, or being further defined as being only for movies that are projected in a theater like IMAX. So most of us are not going to use a 345. So if you see those in a record, you need to look at it real carefully. It may be being used incorrectly, or it may be for like a film to be projected in a theater. I think mostly it's going to be old and misused, and you'll just need to take that out. So those are some examples of things that are sort of newer fields. 341 is one of the newest fields we have, and this is where you can really address captioning and that mode of access. And we also have some notes where you can address that too. So if you are cataloging, for example, a YouTube video or some digital content, and there's a transcript that goes with it or captioning on that particular content, I think it's worthwhile to go ahead and use that 341 because, you know, we really are starting to look at how we can make this digital content more accessible for everyone. And part of that is that in our cataloging, we need to record that so people can find what resources we have that are accessible for them. Series statements, I talked a little bit about the 440 being obsolete. So if the 440 is obsolete, what do you do? Well, if the 440 is obsolete, then you would create a 490 and an 830 pair. Your 830 is what the 490 is, and then you would just look at the 490. For 440, you would just sort of make the same field twice. That'd be the easiest way to deal with that. Giving you some examples of series. You can also make a local series. So if you want to have something maybe grouped together, or like, you know, I don't know if they finally put all the Harry Potters together in a series or not, but let's say you wanted all the Harry Potters to show up together and for people to be able to see them, then you could do a local series, which would be a 490, and then you just wouldn't have an 830 for them, and people could at least maybe see them that way. Contents notes, I am a huge fan of contents notes. So remember I was talking about, like, anytime you're cataloging, or if you receive something. I once cataloged a volume of a set where there was a 90-year publishing gap. That is right, a 90-year publishing gap. Now, how did that happen? Well, it was Harvard, and they had been publishing this set like back in the, oh gosh, around the turn of the century, and then one of the faculty in the classics department died, and they decided that they were going to revive this set in his honor, and they were going to finish it out. So, I mean, a 90-year publishing gap. And thank goodness the person who cataloged the set, when they got the one before me, they added all kinds of notes, including the note from the preface that explained this whole thing. And so I looked at this record, and you know, the dates in the I was like right at 1900, I think. So the date's 1900, and here I have something in the 2000s, and it's like, how can this be part of something from the 1900s? Well, there it was in the notes field, because some cataloger had done such a great job of recording that information when they came across it. So, you know, think about what you're doing when you see something that comes across your desk that doesn't quite match the record. Look at it very carefully, see if you need to add something to that record to account for that difference. Is it something that can be accounted for with the record? You know, my record matches everything, but, and you especially see this with monographic sets and serials, where you may need to account for small differences someplace in the record. But you really have to look at it very careful to figure out, is this a different thing and it needs a new edition? It needs to be a new edition, or is this the same thing, but there's just some little publishing difference about it that I need to let people know? And that is one of those things where that person just, they did me a solid. And I continued, you know, I added to it and added a little more to that note. And so hopefully the next person along behind me was helped by that too. So lots of notes. You can see you even have a note for target audience. There's that accessibility note where you can explain a little bit more about your accessible content. If you have reproductions, there's a note for that. 590s are local notes, and I would encourage you to use your holdings record if you can, or your item record if you can. If you need to put a local note into an OCLC record, that's like the least of the options, but you do have that 590 where you can do that. But I would highly discourage the 590 unless you absolutely must use a 590 because you have nowhere else to put it. And the reason why is that our records should be neutral in as much as they can. Subject headings, I'm not going to go through all of these. Your common subdivisions, there's your A, which we usually don't see. V is for form subdivisions. You will see some overlap between that and genres, and we're going to look at genres in just a second. X is just a general topical subdivision. Y is chronological, which has to do with you know, dates when things happen, and Z, of course, is geographic subdivisions. So examples, you can, you know, spend some time looking at this. You see here we have this electrical wiring interior. That is actually an older form of a topical subject heading. We don't invert subject headings now when we create them, but if you needed to use interior electrical wiring, you had a book on interior electrical wiring, you would use the form that appears in the Library of Congress subject headings. If you're going to code it as a 650 second indicator 0, which is Library of Congress subject headings. You know, so this whole process of assigning subject headings gets very, very tricky pretty quickly, but sort of the key to know is that each subdivision is defined according to what it is, and then of course the Library of Congress subject headings guides then define how these particular topics appear and how you use them. So you know, if you have, for example, Hurricane Katrina, which we know happened, is it 10 years ago, 20 years ago now? Gosh, long time ago. Anyway, because that is tied to a date and time, and that name won't be used again as a hurricane, that would not then get a date associated with it. It should just stand as Hurricane Katrina for the subject heading. And the reason why is it sort of creates a circular logic kind of thing, but that's Library of Congress subject heading guidelines in terms of how you create chronological subdivisions or when you use them. So the rules for how you use those topics and what terms you actually choose come from the thesaurus guidelines. How they're coded comes from the MARC guidelines, which both of those can get tricky, but I think the MARC guidelines are a little bit easier. Genre terms and form terms, there's actually a list here, and I've given you the link to the list. You pick off the list. It's pretty short, but this is where you include things like film noir or cartoons or, you know, biography, something like that, where you include something about the form or the nature of it. So 650 subject headings are what the item is about, what the resource is about. Genre terms are something about the nature of it, and then the form term is very similar to the subfield V as we see in exhibitions. It is that form term. And there is some overlap with that, and we're starting to talk about whether or not we should get rid of the subfield V and just use the 655 for the form. So there's some discussion about that, and I think at some point the subfield V will go away, as we see in the amateurs manuals and the exhibitions. I think at some point we'll see that go away, but not until these genre form terms are more robust. So I think that is going to happen. We're starting to see some discussion about that. So, you know, as we create something new, then we start to look at, are we duplicating information? Are we making redundant information in our records? And if so, how do we handle that? And speaking of new, we can also now use the 655 for alternative vocabularies. These are Getty examples, so from art and architecture. So AA2, AAT, art and architecture. It follows the same format as defined for 655. So 655, second indicator 7 is for other vocabularies. So that's for, you know, other vocabularies that we may have listed. And then, of course, we have just our regular terms here that's coming from that Getty thesaurus. And then you see the subfield 2, and there's that pipe that we're seeing, that subfield 2. There's where we're having a numerical subfield. And again, this is defined by the MARC manual and the MARC committee. So when you go look at the MARC manual, you will start seeing examples for like alternate vocabularies, but they must be defined in that subfield 2. So that's the same thing we're seeing here. We have a 655, second indicator 7. We're using sort of an alternate vocabulary. It's the Library of Congress, even though it's from the Library of Congress, it's the genre form term, so it's basically not one of the other predefined categories. It's sort of in its own category, an other category. And then you can see here we're using actually three different versions of that, sort of three different thesauruses for that, and we're defining them in that subfield 2. So future, as we kind of wrap up here, we are really starting to think about, and we have been thinking about it, but we're really starting to really think about how we're aligning what we're doing with this larger web community. And for those of you who kind of maybe haven't quite got a grasp on RDA, or maybe you're like, gosh, all this terminology is just like so much and it doesn't make sense. Just think about it this way. You know, we kind of came, we were in the front, right? We were sort of in the front of this knowledge and information revolution in terms of creating data. But we were just working in our own little bubble. We were working in the beautiful MARC little bubble, and we worked in that little bubble for a long time. So we kept making MARC better, kept making our ILSs better, all that kind of stuff. And then, you know, 1990s, sort of 95-ish, somewhere around there, the internet suddenly sprang to life. Now, there had been others working on it. The internet existed for a long time in various formats for researchers to work together. But suddenly in the mid-90s, anybody could get on the internet. You know, depending on if you had a PC, which in those days were still kind of limited, but, you know, so we're not talking about that many years ago. People could suddenly, anybody could get on the internet. And so what happened when people started being able to buy computers or go to a library and use computers, or maybe they were using a computer at school? Well, then things like bulletin boards started popping up, and you know, then there were companies like Yahoo who started creating directories of resources, and then Netscape came along, and then people started creating stuff. And then MySpace happened and people were creating stuff, and then Facebook happened and people were creating stuff. And around all of that was a community trying to figure out how to make the transfer of data easier, to make being able to share information easier for the user. And so for all of those people, including maybe ourselves, out there creating data, doing data, creating content, with all this data being created around it without us even thinking about it. You know, you post your comment to Instagram. Well, there's some free text that's searchable. If you have location turned on, there's some hard-coded data. There's the data that Instagram creates, your user account, you know, all that information that gets associated with it. So, you know, that whole community, we're over here in our MARC bubble in the 70s, in the 80s, MARC bubble, and, you know, we're just doing our thing as library people and creating our resources and really thinking about, you know, how can we maintain this level of credibility, this level of integrity. You know, how can we ensure that our students and patrons are finding the resources that we own and finding the best resources? And that was really our mindset for many, many years, right? We were going to be the curator of the resources that our users needed. And we were going to build that data so that people could find what they were looking for. And in the meantime, the community around us is just doing whatever they're doing. They're TikToking, they're Snapchatting, they're whatevering. You know, they're MySpacing and then Facebooking and blogging and Medium and, you know, Quorum and Reddit. And they're doing all their stuff. And we're still over here doing our bubble, except we're not doing our bubble so much. And so around 2013, but even before that, sort of in the late 1990s, as the web was beginning to really take form and people were really starting to figure out what they could do with it, there was a movement to look at our cataloging rules and figure out what we were going to do to align ourselves with this emerging community. And initially we talked about calling it AAC or 3. We just make, you know, the next revision, it'd just be 3. And then there was a group that said, no, 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 this is too big to just revise what we've been doing. We really need to rethink entirely what we've been doing. And so, as one of my friends called it, she even wrote an article, The Existential Cataloger. We really had this moment where we're like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? You know, how can we be part of this? Or why aren't we part of this? As my question was always, why aren't we part of this? And so, you know, there was really that moment of kind of looking at what cataloging was doing to try to figure out how are we going to make our resources seen in this huge world of just, you know, all kinds of stuff. You know, we want, now we're competing with Facebook and Pinterest and Medium and Reddit and fake news and conspiracy websites and all of this, all of these dialogues that are happening around us and these accusations and, you know, lack of truly resources that are not credible. I mean, fake news in the truest sense of the word, resources that are not credible, that have no subject matter expertise, that maybe have no guidelines for the content they write. They don't do any fact checking. I mean, truly thinking about how we can compete with that, because we want, especially if you're dealing with research materials, or you want people to find, you know, accurate information, more than ever, the data we create is critical in helping curate those resources. But we have this MARC thing that has been such, you know, it's been so great, but now it's not great, because who knows how to use MARC? I mean, most of us, you know, some of us know how to use MARC pretty well. Some of us are still struggling in terms of how we use MARC. And then some people have no idea what they're doing with MARC. They're just like, okay, the record looks good, I'm moving on. You know, so if we as a community, if all of our community members do not understand how to use MARC, or why it's important, or how it works, then how in the world can we expect any software out there to understand MARC if our own community struggles as a whole with MARC? You know, we do have experts in MARC, and then we have, you know, lots and lots of people in our community who like, oh, that's a catalog record, but I couldn't tell you anything really about it. Or why is it even important? You know, to not understand those things. So, you know, we looked at rewriting, starting to rewrite our rules, and we also wanted to make sure that we started looking at other communities that have been doing similar things to us. You know, our museums, our historical societies, you know, what some of you may be doing in your institutional repository, a digital archive. Like, how can we work together with all of these resources that we are curating to make sure that people are finding the best resources? And I think even now more than ever, that is so critical, that we stand as credible sources and credible connections to information that is accurate, that is truthful, that is relevant. And even if we're showing people what bias looks like, or what true fake news looks like, even if we're showing them that we're able to flag it in such a way to teach people how to recognize that. I mean, libraries have such an incredible critical role right now. And our data has that role too, because as authoritative, accurate resources, our data is created by that in terms of how people access it. So we really have begun the long road away, and I'm saying it's a long road because I've talked to lots of vendors in the last few years about this, the long road away from MARC record to our next data carrier. So we are starting to look at how will our records, you know, look in the future, and what choices do we have for our records? We are currently expanding our MARC subfields to provide space for linked data. So when I said, you know, for an authority record, it's like, oh, you're going to use the form that appears in the authority record. So, you know, you go in, you look at the authority record for my name, you put it into your record. If you have, you know, my little book, you put it into your record. But then let's say I decide, you know, there's another one, actually there's several, but, you know, there's another Robin M. Fay, and I decide I want to use my middle name, and the authority record gets updated, but your record doesn't. You know, so how do we, you know, what can we do? So one of the things we can do in terms of helping maintain our records and helping keep our information accurate is that we're looking to figure out a way that rather than typing in those authoritative names, rather than typing in the Library of Congress subject heading, we could just link to it. And then when those, you know, inverted forms of those subject headings, like the electrical wiring interior, should that get changed to interior electrical wiring, which would make more sense for all of us, right? We wouldn't need to do any work in our catalogs. You know, we'd be linking to that subject heading, and it would just automatically change in our catalog. The other thing we're looking at is we're looking at how we can enrich our data to provide relationship designators, so to better describe those roles, so the subfield E's for all of the actors and cast members and participants, especially in media. But we're also then looking at how we can enrich our records by adding sort of additional content. I mean, for example, for me, you know, I've written, well, one book and, you know, a few articles and things like that, and I have a gazillion things on the web, right? So like, how would you represent all of my things in a library record? Or would it be useful for someone who is, you know, looking at one of my articles that you might own, or, you know, that you have a copy of because they're freely available, but that you have a copy of, would it be useful for them to also have access to my website, or also have access to my SlideShare, or maybe have access to a particular slide presentation that's publicly available that would be supplemental to that particular article? And so how can we start adding that, sort of enriching our resources? And so this is one of the things that's been one of the most recent developments, is looking at adding the subfield 0 or 1, and that is where we can provide either a URI or more likely linked data, so we can provide that link to an authoritative resource. And we're starting to use 0 for authority, so that would be like if you wanted to put next to my 100 field, you could put a link to my virtual internet authority URL, or a link to the Library of Congress authority file online to my name, so you could have that. And at some point, as we get more of these links in, it will make it easier for maintenance, as I've already mentioned, but then when we migrate in the future, at some point we could just get rid of those text strings that we've typed in, and we could just link to that data, which would then, oh, I just think about how much like maintenance and cleanup I've done over the years, and like how much of that could be automated. It'd be great, right? And then in addition to that, then we could even provide those links to other things. You know, like think about all the Star Wars things. I mean, would it be useful to, you know, link to maybe some other resource, maybe something online? You know, you have a book about the making of Star Wars, and there is a video interview with George Lucas talking about the making of Star Wars. Would it be useful to add that, you know, as a supplemental resource in your record, to bring more of that content from outside of our world, still curating it, right? Because we would be the ones looking at the content and making that decision about what content is out there that would be value added for that data. So that's some of the, I think, exciting stuff we're starting to do. We are starting to talk about taking away the ISBD so that we can make our records easier to transfer, because, you know, this is another area where if you're trying to transfer between systems and things like that, they really don't know what to do with that punctuation. And sometimes we don't even know what to do with that punctuation. So, you know, kind of thinking about, we don't need this anymore. I mean, it was really meant for like card catalogs, and, you know, that was a while ago. So we really don't need it anymore. And can we get rid of it? And there was a proposal by a PCC group, which is the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, which is that one of those national groups that looks at things like that, to eliminate ISBD punctuation. There are some institutions, I would call it testing, removing ISBD punctuation. So you may see some records for newer material without that punctuation. If you are copy cataloging and you see records without punctuation, then I would just say that you need to make a decision, you know, what you need to do. And you'll notice, I'm going to say you're going to notice that you don't see punctuation. There won't be periods at the end of a field. You know, it's going to be pretty obvious. And if you see those records, then I would just say, you know, you may want to talk to somebody in, you know, in your department. If you're in a department, other people. If you're in a consortia where you talk about things like this, you may want to bring up that record as an example, or you may even just want to talk to your systems folks. If you have system folks, to ask them, you know, what happens with this? Can I import it? Will it work okay? Or is it going to cause problems? If you are a solo librarian and you have a vendor you work with, you may ask them the same question. Oh, I have a record that doesn't have ISBD punctuation. You know, is that okay to use it, or is it going to cause a problem? Or you may try to import it and see what happens. And then when it causes a problem, or if it causes a problem, you may need to figure it out. So giving you some examples of linked data in real world objects, and real world objects are just linking out to those other resources that we would see as being useful. So it could be we're linking out to a Wikidata entry or Wikipedia entry. It could be that we're linking out to, you know, a website. This is a nice BBC project where they are creating like little bios of musicians. And so we have Michael Stipe here, and then there's his authorized form of his name from the authority file. There's the link to his authority record in the Library of Congress. And then we have this nice link over to that BBC project for the biography. So you can see from these, just these examples, that the resources we would be choosing in this sort of value-added cataloging, enriching our metadata, cataloging kind of process, we're still curating them. So these aren't just things that are just going to come in from anywhere. We're still going to curate them. And then, of course, you can do linked data. So linking out to data, you can do that in a Getty record too. So here's the example of Getty, and then with their terminology, and then linking out to a record. And I just want to briefly mention as we wrap up here very quickly, don't have much time to talk about it, but MARCXML is a way that we can move records from MARC to something else. So it's sort of the in-between process. I've given you some more information here, so I'm just going to kind of skip through it. There are tools to help you if you're interested in working with MARC records outside of MARC. So let's say you needed to go from MARC to Dublin Core in your institutional repository, or you wanted to go to Dublin Core into a MARC record. You can use tools to do that. XML is a translation tool, a translator, what I call a translation tool that will allow you to migrate between systems, which is very useful, and BibFrame, which is sort of what we're looking to in the future as our carrier beyond MARC. Will use it as well. Looks something like this, looks very different from what a MARC record usually looks like, but just take some time and kind of look at this record and kind of think about, you can see tag defined, you can see indicator defined. If there's nothing for indicator, that's equal to blank. So again, they're accounting for those positions. So just take a, take a couple of minutes when you can after you've done some looking at MARC records, and just take a look at this and kind of see where, if you can map and see the connection between a MARC record. I think you will. Giving you lots of tools if you want to play with MARCXML. So lots of fun things. MARCEdit is a fantastic tool for working with MARC records. You can use it to clean up records, you can use it to validate records, you can use it to do linked data and do some enrichment of records. You can use it for all different kinds of things. So if you need to do some cleanup on your records, or you need to do some validation of your records, or you're working between systems, or maybe you're going to get ready for migration, you could even do some validations and checks and work on your records through MARCEdit. And on that note, I am going to wrap it up right here. And if there are any questions or any thoughts, I am super excited about linked data. I think it's going to be a great move forward from us. For those of you who are copy cataloging, if you see those records with zeros and ones at the end, with those link data, those URLs in them, I would say leave it for now. See what happens in your system, because you will, just by leaving that information in, you will be helping to prepare your records for the future. So see how easy that is? Just accept it if you see that information there.